The northern forest was still locked in the deep grip of winter when Anna stepped out from the small wooden ranger station just as the sun began to push over the horizon. The air was crisp and thin, each breath pulling cold into her lungs in a way that felt clean but unforgiving. Overnight, a fresh layer of snow had fallen, smoothing out the roughness of the previous day's tracks and laying a bright, unbroken cover over the land. In these early hours, when human movement was rare, the first prints on the snow often belonged to the animals who lived in the shelter of the trees and the frozen ridges beyond. Anna's work demanded that she notice those prints, not just their shape, but their depth, direction, and the subtle differences that might tell her something was wrong. She followed the narrow path that led from the station toward a shallow bend in a frozen stream. A faint mist drifted above the surface where water moved unseen under the ice. That was when she saw them. Paw prints pressed sharply into the untouched white, moving from the open bank toward the line of trees across the way. The sight stopped her mid-step, her eyes dropping to take in the details. They were fresh, she could tell by the crisp edges of the impressions and the way they caught the faint light from the low sun. At first glance, the shape of each print suggested a large canine, most likely a wolf, possibly one of the smaller packs known to move through this section of forest. But it wasn't the identity of the animal that held her attention. It was the irregularity of the pattern. Instead of the even, flowing stride typical of a healthy predator, these prints varied in spacing. One side pressed deeper into the snow, the other lighter, as though the animal favored a leg. Every few strides, the trail shifted slightly sideways, as if balance had been momentarily lost. She stepped closer, crouching to study them. In some places, the snow was disturbed beyond the edges of the print, the marks fanning outward where a paw had slid before lifting. This was more than just cautious movement on ice. It hinted at fatigue or injury. Anna's experience told her that an animal moving like this in deep winter was vulnerable. In cold this severe, a healthy wolf could travel miles without slowing, but a wounded one would lose precious heat and energy with each step. If the injury prevented hunting, starvation could follow quickly. The forest could be beautiful and quiet, but in truth, it was a place where survival was decided by small margins. Anna rose again, shifting her pack into place on her shoulders. She began to follow the line of tracks, her boots crunching lightly through the snow. The forest was not yet fully awake. The snow absorbed sound so thoroughly that her own footfalls seemed softer than usual. In this muted world, even small disturbances stood out. A bent reed here, a patch of churned snow there. Each was a fragment of the animal's journey. After several minutes, the signs grew more telling. Near a tangle of young pines, she spotted the first flecks of color against the white. Tiny drops, deep red, spaced irregularly along the track. Blood. She paused, scanning the ground ahead, then crouched again to look more closely. The droplets were small but clear, their edges freezing in the cold. Combined with the deepened prints and the drag marks, the story became clearer. The animal was hurt badly enough to leave a trail, and the injury was slowing it down. Anna straightened, eyes narrowing on the direction the tracks took. They led away from the open stretch of riverbank toward the heavier shadow of the tree line. Beyond those first few rows of trees, the forest thickened quickly, and visibility would drop. In that cover, it would be easier for an injured wolf to hide, but harder for her to find it. The risks were plain. If she approached too quickly, the animal could bolt into the deeper forest, worsening the injury. If she moved too slowly, the wolf could collapse before she reached it. Every choice carried a cost. She adjusted her pace, lengthening her stride slightly but keeping her movement steady. Snow dusted her coat as she brushed against low branches. Here and there, she found fresh disturbances in the white, a scattering where the animal had stumbled, sending loose snow outward in a soft spray. The spacing between prints grew shorter, the drag marks longer. It was slowing down, but not stopping. The wind shifted, a soft push from the north that carried with it a faint metallic tang. Anna had learnt to recognize scents carried in cold air. This one was subtle but undeniable, the smell of blood carried far in still conditions. She scanned the spaces between the trunks ahead, half expecting movement. Nothing stirred. Only the slow fall of snow from a high branch marked the air. She pressed on, eyes fixed on the broken trail. Each track was a reminder of what was at stake. Out here, an injury was more than pain. It was a countdown. The animal would lose heat faster through the wounded limb, and without enough energy to hunt, its reserves would burn away quickly. If the wound had been caused by a snare or trap, infection was almost certain. Even in freezing temperatures, bacteria could spread through tissue. A wolf that could not hunt, run, or defend itself was unlikely to see another week. Crossing into the tree line, the air seemed to close in around her. The snow here was softer and less compacted by wind, and it muffled her steps even more. The tracks curved slightly to the left, weaving between the dark bases of spruce and fir. A low branch had swept across the path at one point, erasing the marks for several feet. She moved carefully around it, scanning ahead until the paw prints appeared again beyond the sweep of needles. Anna kept her breathing slow, resisting the urge to push forward too quickly. Any sudden noise could send the animal deeper into the trees, out of reach. The silence was heavy, broken only by the soft hiss of falling snow settling onto the canopy. She leaned slightly forward as she walked, studying the way the trail seemed to tell its own story. A story of persistence despite weakness, of an animal that still moved because stopping was not an option. She thought of the times she had tracked healthy wolves, their prints even and deliberate, covering long distances in perfect rhythm. This trail was different. It spoke of weight unevenly carried, of a pace chosen by necessity rather than choice. Every mark on the snow hinted at a body working against itself, pushing forward for reasons only instinct could explain. Near a cluster of smaller trees, the prints deepened suddenly, as if the wolf had paused, leaning heavily onto its forelegs. No signs of a struggle, no circling, just a moment where it had gathered itself before moving on. Anna paused there too, letting the quiet wrap around her. Her eyes traced the path ahead, imagining the wolf just out of sight, moving at the same steady but faltering pace. She spoke then, barely above a breath. "Easy now." The words for her own steadiness as much as for the animal. There was no answer except the faint fall of snow from a branch above, settling into the deepening white around her. She tightened her grip on her walking stick and stepped forward again. The trail led deeper into the forest, toward a place where shadows stretched long even in daylight. The pattern of the prints remained uneven but unwavering. A line pressed into the snow by something that, despite pain and cold, still moved toward whatever safety it believed lay ahead. She followed without hesitation. Every step closed the distance between ranger and wolf, between injury and the chance, however slim, of survival. In the frozen stillness of the northern forest, that was all that mattered now. The forest thickened as Anna moved forward, the trees pressing closer, their dark trunks rising from a floor of snow that lay in soft, uneven drifts. The light was muted here, caught in the web of branches above, and the air felt heavier, not with wind or moisture, but with a kind of suspended quiet. The line of paw prints ahead had grown more telling, their pattern tighter, each stride shorter than the last. Where before the tracks had shown some balance between the left and right, now one side pressed deeper into the snow, the other lighter, leaving the impression of an uneven gait. The drag marks were clearer now. In places, the paw seemed to have skimmed the snow before lifting, smudging the edges of the print. That wasn't the careful, energy-saving step of a predator moving through winter terrain. It was the step of an animal whose leg could not carry its share of the weight. Anna's gaze followed the marks as they threaded between the trunks. The rhythm was faltering. Here and there, the snow told more of the story. A tuft of pale fur clung to a low spruce branch, the fibers tangled where they had brushed past. In another spot, a single hair lay on the snow itself, almost invisible against the white until the light caught it. These were the signs of a body moving lower than it should, drifting close to the edges of its path. Anna stopped for a moment, crouching to examine one of the prints more closely. Inside its sharp outline lay a small drop of red, perfectly round and still bright against the frozen surface. It was fresh, laid there within the last hour. She straightened, letting her eyes travel ahead. The trail continued without hesitation. But each print carried the weight of effort. The blood told her the injury was open. In these conditions, that meant more than pain. It meant that the wolf was losing heat faster, its reserves draining with each movement. Out here, survival hinged on efficiency. Every wasted step, every moment spent compensating for a wound, tilted the balance toward collapse. Anna shifted the strap of her pack across her shoulder. The medical kit inside felt heavier than it was, a reminder of why she was here. This wasn't simply tracking for observation. This was intervention, if she could reach in time. Her mind stayed on the practical facts. A foreleg injury in a wolf reduced its ability to hunt, defend itself, and travel long distances for food. If the wound came from a snare or trap, infection was almost certain, even in the cold. Starvation, blood loss, or sepsis. All could take hold in days. Out here, those timelines shortened further. Her pace adjusted, quickening just enough to close the distance but keeping her movements quiet. A wolf that still had strength to run would do so if startled, even injured, and that might carry it deep into terrain too thick to navigate quickly. But she couldn't linger. The tracks ahead were growing clearer, more desperate. On a gentle incline, the prints deepened noticeably. The drag marks lengthened, and the snow churned slightly where the animal had fought for grip. At the crest of the slope, she found a shallow depression where the snow was pressed flat, surrounded by prints pointing in different directions. The wolf had stopped here, not to change course but to rest its weight before continuing. That pause told her the same thing the tracks already had. Fatigue was setting in. The longer it stopped, the colder it would get. A predator built for movement could lose heat quickly when still, especially one already weakened. The air carried a change as she moved on, a faint metallic edge, so subtle it could be lost if she weren't looking for it. It was the scent of blood carried thin in the cold air, threading through the stillness. She paused briefly, scanning the trees ahead, searching for movement. Nothing broke the view. The forest here was dense, the ground uneven with shallow dips and raised roots hidden beneath the snow. Dropping into one of the dips, she noted how the tracks leaned harder to one side. She followed them with her eyes, seeing how the injured foreleg forced the animal to compensate, the rear paws stepping shorter to match. In one place, the fur in the snow was darker, slightly matted at the tips, pulled loose where the leg must have brushed against itself or the ground. She crouched again, reading the print as if it were a map. The toes were splayed wider than before, gripping for balance. That kind of spread spoke of strain. She rose slowly, keeping her breathing steady. "Almost there," she murmured, the words barely audible under her breath. It wasn't meant to call out, only to steady her own focus. The forest around her felt like it was holding itself still, the absence of sound almost absolute. Even the occasional crows that called from the edges of the forest were absent here. The silence was broken only by the faint hiss of snow settling from the branches above, falling in loose spirals to the ground. Ahead, a break in the trees offered a change in the path. The light there was different, hinting at a clearing or an open stretch where she might finally see more than just the evidence of the wolf's passing. She adjusted her grip on the walking stick in her right hand, knowing that the next stretch could reveal the animal itself, and with it, the moment she would have to decide how to close the final distance without causing panic. The stakes sat plainly in her mind. If she reached it soon, there was a chance to clean the wound, treat it, and release the animal before it lost more strength. If she failed, the wolf would continue on its current course, deeper into the forest, slower with each step, the blood loss and cold combining against it. Out here, an animal rarely had the luxury of time. As she stepped closer to the clearing, the tracks shifted slightly, the spacing between them changing again. The wolf's stride was even shorter now, the drag marks heavier. The blood drops had grown more frequent, each one marking the snow like a clock counting down. She moved forward carefully, her pace steady but with no wasted motion. The cold bit at the edges of her face, but she kept her eyes forward, reading the line of prints as if they were words written in the snow. Every sign pointed to the same truth. The wolf was tiring, and quickly. The forest here offered little in the way of easy prey. Rabbits and voles would be scarce this late in winter, and the energy needed to catch them was more than an injured predator could afford. If the animal had been alone before the injury, it was likely still alone now. And without a pack, its survival depended entirely on its own failing strength. The path narrowed again beyond the clearing, threading between two leaning spruce. She could see the prints curving slightly to the left, avoiding a patch of snow thinned over hidden ice. Even in its weakened state, the wolf still avoided hazards that could cost more strength. That instinct, to keep moving, to conserve what little remained, was the only thing holding it together now. Anna followed without breaking her rhythm. She knew that the distance between them was closing. The silence of the forest, the blood on the snow, the deepened prints, they were all part of the same story. One that would end soon, one way or another. The line of paw prints carried on ahead, fragile but unbroken, a thin thread of life pulling itself through the cold. The trees began to thin, and the snow ahead took on a faint silver sheen where a weak light slipped through the clouded sky. Anna slowed, her boots sinking softly into the drift as she approached the edge of a small clearing. A light mist hung low over the open ground, moving just enough to blur the shapes within. She scanned the pale expanse, her eyes searching for a break in the uniform white. Then she saw it, a dark form standing low and still, its outline softened by the haze. The animal's head was level with its shoulders, the body angled slightly, as if bracing against something unseen. One front leg hung just above the snow, bent awkwardly, the paw turned inward. The wolf's coat was dull, matted in places where the fur had frozen into clumps. Crystals of ice clung to the longer hairs along his flank, and a faint ridge of frost traced the top of his muzzle. His breath rose in slow, shallow bursts, disappearing into the mist almost as soon as it formed. He did not move away. Instead, he held his position, watching her approach from the stillness of the open ground. The set of his ears, the faint tremor in his lifted leg, the shallow rise and fall of his ribs, each was a measure of his condition. He had strength enough to stand, but not enough to flee. Anna stopped just inside the line of trees, lowering her shoulders slightly so her outline seemed less sharp. She let her gaze trace the space between them, noting every detail that spoke to his state. The lifted leg bore a dark stain near the joint, the fur there stiff with dried blood and ringed by a swelling that disrupted the smooth line of the limb. If the injury was from a snare or trap, the cut could be deep, hidden under the fur. The swelling suggested infection, and in this cold, untreated wounds could lock the joint in days. Without the ability to put weight on it, his hunting days had already ended. For a long moment, neither moved. The forest around them stayed silent, even the mist holding its shape as if unwilling to disturb the space between them. Anna knew that if she made the wrong move now, he might force himself to run, spending the last of his reserves to disappear into the far side of the clearing. If he ran, the injury could worsen beyond repair. If he stayed, she had a chance to intervene. She shifted one step forward, slow enough that her boots' descent into the snow made no sudden sound. The wolf's eyes followed her movement, dark and steady. His head dipped slightly, not in submission, but in the way of an animal adjusting its balance. The lifted paw trembled once, then steadied in the air. His tail hung low, the tip brushing the snow as it moved faintly with each breath. These were not the gestures of an animal preparing to charge or bolt. They were the signs of one weighing its last options. Anna's voice was quiet when it came, carrying no demand, only presence. "Easy now." The sound was barely more than the movement of air, but it held steady. The wolf's ears flicked once, acknowledging the tone. His gaze didn't waver. She moved another step into the clearing, letting the mist close behind her. The space between them narrowed to a dozen paces. From here, she could see more. The hollowness just behind his ribs, the way the muscles along his lifted leg had begun to thin, and the dampness at the edge of the wound where fresh blood had seeped through the frozen crust. His weight leaned heavily to the other side, the sound leg holding him steady but not comfortably so. The stillness felt fragile. She could read the limits in him, the line where standing would give way to collapse, the threshold beyond which his body would not recover. In the cold, that line was closer than it looked. If she could keep him here, keep him from spending more strength, there might be a chance to reach him before the balance tipped. But if she misjudged, the forest would take him before she could intervene. The wolf's chest rose again, slower this time. His breath came out in a soft plume, curling upward before fading into the pale air. Somewhere beyond the clearing, a branch shifted under the weight of snow, the faint sound carrying through the stillness. His ears twitched, then settled again. His focus never leaving her. The connection held in that quiet space, not trust, but recognition. Two lives in the same moment, each measuring what came next. Anna stopped moving, anchoring herself in that fragile pause. The cold pressed between them, but the distance felt measured not in steps but in the risk of what any step might cost. The wolf stood in the mist, leg lifted, too tired to run yet not ready to fall, holding the last of his strength in the open ground. Anna kept her movement steady. The measured rhythm of each step meant to carry no threat. The wolf's eyes stayed on her, unblinking in the cold mist, and she let that watchfulness guide her pace. The clearing snow was crusted here and there with patches of ice, and she chose her footing carefully, closing the distance a little at a time. When she was near enough to read the set of his muscles, she spoke, a low murmur that held no demand, only presence. "It's okay," she breathed. The words carried more in tone than meaning. His ears twitched, the sound acknowledged, but he didn't shift his weight to move away. From here, the injury was no longer a question. Around his raised foreleg the fur was parted by an unnatural shape, a loop of thin, rusted metal, twisted tight into the flesh above the paw. The edges of the wound were raw, the surrounding skin swollen and hot even in the freezing air. Beneath the mat of stiff, blood-darkened fur, the leg was thickened with fluid. The infection spreading up toward the joint. Each shallow tremor of the limb spoke to pain held for days, maybe longer. The metal had bitten deep. The wire was so embedded that the skin had begun to close over parts of it, trapping it in place. She had seen snares before, the cruel simplicity of them. A single loop, anchored to a branch or stake, set to close on whatever limb or neck entered it. For an animal built to travel miles each day, being caught was more than an injury. It meant hunger, cold, and the fight of each hour against pain. For this wolf, the fact that he stood at all was a measure of his endurance, but it was also the sign of how little time remained before exhaustion would take him down. If the infection reached his bloodstream, he would not survive another night. Anna stopped just outside the range where a sudden lunge might bring them into contact. She lowered her posture slightly, letting her arms rest loosely at her sides. The wolf's breathing was shallow, his chest lifting and falling in uneven intervals. His good foreleg held most of his weight, the muscles there taut, while the injured one hung suspended, paw curled slightly inward. His tail lay still behind him, not tucked in fear, but without the energy to lift. The silence in the clearing was broken only by the faint sound of air moving through his nose. She took a slow breath of her own, assessing what she carried. The tranq dart in her kit would take effect quickly, but she had to ensure a clean shot, enough to bring him down without panic, without driving him into a final burst of movement that could tear the leg further. Any chase, even a short one, could turn the damage into something beyond repair. The stakes sat plain in her mind. If she waited too long, infection would win. If she moved too quickly, she might lose him to the forest. Her eyes moved once more over the leg, noting the way the swelling extended above the snare. The discolored skin visible in the gaps of fur. There was no mistaking the timeline. He would not survive without the wire being cut away, without the wound being cleaned and treated. Out here, those steps would need to happen within hours, not days. She let her gaze return to his face. His eyes were still fixed on her, dark and unreadable but steady. He didn't bare teeth or lower his ears. Instead, there was only stillness, the kind that came when movement was no longer worth the cost. Somewhere behind her the wind moved through the upper branches, but on the ground, the air remained heavy. She tightened her grip on the tranquilizer rifle, steadying her breathing. There would be one chance to act, and that chance was now. Anna adjusted her position, the weight of the tranquilizer rifle balanced carefully in her hands. The wolf stood as before, his injured leg held rigid, eyes fixed on her. The snowfall had grown heavier, each flake settling on his back and melting slowly into the rough fur. She drew a measured breath and let it out, aligning her aim with the muscle of his good shoulder. A clean shot here would bring him down quickly without forcing him to run. The dart struck with a faint sound, barely enough to disturb the muffled stillness of the clearing. His ears flicked once, his body tensing as the sedative began to work. At first, he shifted slightly, his weight rocking between his hind legs. Then his good foreleg trembled, the strength leaving it in short waves. Anna stayed still, watching the line of his back lower by slow degrees until the paw of his injured leg touched the snow for the first time. The movement sent a small shudder through him. His breath quickened, each exhale misting the air before being swallowed by the falling snow. Within moments, his balance gave way. He sank to one side, the good leg folding beneath him, his head lowering until his muzzle rested just above the snow's surface. Anna stepped forward without hesitation, crossing the last few paces. The sedative would not last long, and she needed to act before his body began to fight it. Kneeling beside him, she could see the wire more clearly now, rusted and biting deep, the edges cutting into swollen flesh. The skin around it was angry and warm despite the cold, the swelling distorting the shape of the leg. She slid her pack to the ground, unfastening the tools she would need. A small pair of bolt cutters caught the light as she freed them from their wrap. Her gloves moved steadily, working the metal until the loop gave way with a muted snap. The ends sprang slightly apart, releasing the pressure that had been locked into his leg for days. Blood welled instantly from the compressed tissue, darker than a fresh injury. The flow slow but steady. She cleaned the area with what she could spare from her kit, knowing the cold would help slow the bleeding but also hasten the stiffening of the tissue if she delayed. A quick wrap of clean gauze bound the worst of it, layered beneath a heavier bandage that would keep snow from seeping through. The forest around them stayed hushed, the snowfall thick enough now that the edges of the clearing blurred into the white. Anna's movements were precise, each step of the process chosen to buy him more time. Even so, she could feel the urgency pressing in. The sedative would wear off soon, and if she was still working when he stirred, panic could undo everything. She checked his breathing, still fast but steady, the muscles of his chest moving with enough rhythm to reassure her. Frost had begun to form at the edge of the bandage where the moisture of his fur met the air. The cold was claiming its own time, and she knew she needed to move him to shelter before it worked deeper into the leg. But for this moment, the loop of wire was gone, the limb no longer trapped in its unyielding grip. She rested her hand briefly against his shoulder, feeling the slow, solid beat of his heart beneath the thick fur. The snow fell in a steady curtain now, closing the clearing around them. The world beyond had gone quiet, leaving only the sound of their shared breath and the faint creak of branches overhead. The snow was still falling when Anna reached the small field station, her steps measured to keep the stretcher steady. The wolf lay along its length, his weight light for his size, the fur along his flank damp from melted flakes. Inside, the air carried the faint scent of antiseptic, a sharp contrast to the cold, metallic tang of blood that clung to his coat. She eased him onto a thick blanket spread over the floor, her movements slow to avoid jarring the injured leg. His chest rose and fell in quick, shallow breaths, each exhale a faint cloud in the chill of the unheated space. She worked without unnecessary noise, setting out the tools she would need. The bandage she had applied in the clearing was already stiff with frost, and she unwound it carefully, revealing the wound in full for the first time. The wire had left a deep groove in the flesh, the edges raw and inflamed. She rinsed the leg with warm, sterile water, the runoff staining the cloth beneath him a dull red. Bits of dirt and dried blood loosened, revealing skin that was hot to the touch despite the cold air. She cleaned slowly but thoroughly, pausing when his muscles twitched under her hands. The snare itself was tangled deep into the fur, its ends twisted back on themselves. With careful pressure from the cutters, she removed the remaining length, the metal falling away into her palm. It was lighter than it looked, and she set it aside, the weight of what it had cost far greater than its size. She checked the circulation in the limb, noting the sluggish return of color when she pressed gently against the paw. Time would tell if the damage to the tissues was reversible, but without the wire constricting it, at least the leg had a chance. As she wrapped the wound in fresh layers of gauze, the wolf stirred. His head lifted slightly, eyes half open following the movement of her hands. There was no sound from him, only the steady tracking of her actions. His body stayed still, the tension in his shoulders easing fractionally as the bandage was secured. He seemed caught between exhaustion and awareness, the weight of the last days pressing heavier than the sedative still in his system. Anna leaned back for a moment, letting him settle. The room was quiet except for the faint rustle of fabric and the soft rhythm of his breathing. She could see the line of his ribs with each inhale, the slow rise and fall steadying now that the pain had eased. Outside, the snow continued to fall against the window, the light shifting toward late afternoon. She knew the cold would return with nightfall, but for now, inside these walls, the wound was clean, the leg wrapped, and his body was still warm enough to fight. His eyes closed part way, the lids heavy, though his head stayed turned toward her. She adjusted the blanket beneath him, tucking it close along his side. The scent of antiseptic lingered in the air, mingling with the dampness of thawing ice from his coat. For the moment, the risk of the wire's grip was gone. What remained was a different fight, against infection, against the cold still waiting outside, but it was one he could now face with a better chance. His breathing slowed again, and Anna sat nearby, her gaze steady on him as the snow whispered against the glass. The days passed in the slow rhythm of care and recovery. The small field station stayed cold, but the shelter it provided kept the wind from reaching him, and the steady supply of food gave his body a chance to rebuild. At first, he barely moved, conserving energy, his head lifting only when she approached with fresh water or a small portion of meat. The bandage around his leg stayed clean, the swelling easing little by little as the infection receded. He ate in measured bites, his jaw working slowly, pausing often to rest before taking more. Each time she entered, his eyes found her, following her movements without shifting his body, watchful but no longer tense. By the third day, he began to rise when she came, favoring the injured leg but steady on the other. The ice that had clung stubbornly to his coat had melted away, replaced by the rough texture of drying fur. He moved more within the small enclosure, testing the leg in short steps, the limp still pronounced but not as sharp. The once shallow breaths grew deeper, the line of his ribs less stark as the days wore on. She cleaned and rewrapped the wound each morning, her hands slow and even, noting how the skin was knitting together where the wire had once cut deep. The air outside stayed bitter, the snow falling in brief flurries between stretches of pale, cold light. From his place inside, he would stand near the gate, nose lifted slightly to catch the scents that drifted in. His ears shifted toward sounds she could not hear, the forest beyond the fence pulling at him even as the leg continued to heal. The risks were still there, the winter, the strength he had yet to regain, but each day his body proved a little more ready. By the end of the week, he could put weight on the leg for several strides, the limp still visible but no longer preventing movement. That morning, Anna stood at the gate with her hand on the latch. She watched him from where she stood, gauging the set of his shoulders and the way he carried his head. The decision to release was always measured against the reality of survival. If he left too soon, the forest could undo the work of the past days in a single night. But holding him longer than necessary was not the point. His place was not here. She lifted the latch. The gate swung outward, opening the path to the trees. He did not rush forward. Instead, he stepped slowly, one paw into the snow, then another. The cold surface gave slightly beneath his weight, his claws leaving clear marks in the pale crust. He paused, head turning toward the scent of the open air. The forest was quiet, the branches heavy with snow, the ground marked only by the faint tracks of birds. After a breath's length, he moved again, passing through the opening without a sound. The limp was still there, but it no longer held him back. She watched as he crossed the short stretch between the fence and the tree line. At the edge, he hesitated only a moment. The dark shape of him standing against the white. Then he slipped into the shelter of the trees, his form vanishing into the stillness of the forest. The snow closed behind him, leaving only his tracks pressed into the surface, leading away into the quiet. The weeks that followed brought deeper cold to the forest. Snow fell in long, steady spells, settling into drifts that softened the outlines of everything they touched. Anna's patrols continued along the familiar routes, her eyes trained as always to read the quiet signs the land left behind. On a morning, heavy with low clouds, she returned to the same tree line where the trail of that winter rescue had first begun. The air was still, the forest holding the kind of silence that came before fresh snow. Beneath the firs, the surface lay undisturbed except for a narrow path that broke cleanly through the white. She crouched at its edge, her gaze following the impressions. The paw prints were sharp, their edges not yet rounded by wind. Each step was evenly spaced, the weight balanced, and the stride steady. The front pads pressed deep, the claws scoring faint arcs into the crust. She measured them against memory. They matched the wolf she had released. The limp was gone. His tracks told the story plainly. A full gait, no drag, no uneven pressure. He had his strength back. As her eyes traced the line forward, another pattern emerged. Beside the larger trail ran a second set of prints. Smaller, lighter, and set close enough that the two paths often overlapped. They followed the same rhythm, matching step for step, veering only when the smaller prints cut slightly inward, brushing close to the larger ones. The sizes told their own truth. This was not another adult moving beside him. It was younger, surer of where to place its paws, following the same line through the snow. Anna stayed still, reading the quiet message the tracks left behind. The smaller wolf was healthy. Its steps showed no hesitation, and the pads pressed firmly into the crust. That closeness in their path spoke of familiarity, the kind formed through time spent side by side. Somewhere beyond the tree line, the wolf she had freed now moved with another. Whether kin or a companion found after release, she couldn't know. But the signs were there in the snow, as certain as the injury once had been. The cold pressed against her cheeks, the light above dim with the weight of coming snow. She let her eyes follow the twin trails until they curved away, vanishing into the shadow of the pines. In the distance, the forest kept its secrets, the branches swaying faintly in the still air. She rose, leaving the prints undisturbed, their pattern carrying forward into the quiet that lay ahead. Somewhere in that stillness, the wolf was whole again, and he was no longer alone.